Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to say hello and welcome to this lunchtime webinar. So I think I'm just slightly ahead, so I'm just going to talk for a second until we get to 12:30. So thanks. Yeah, it's now 12:30. So thanks for attending and taking time out of your lunch breaks, busy days to listen to me. Hopefully talk. Well, not hopefully. I'm going to talk to you about the a 30-minute session on the ISTQB Certified Tester Foundation level or foundation course in software testing. So just to introduce myself to you, my name is John Young. I am one of the trainers at TSG Training. As you can see from this slide, I've been around for a while, so I've been involved in ISTQB scheme since it started back in 2006. And so I'm just admitting people as talking. And just to explain what I'm going to be doing in the 30 minutes. So our agenda for today. I'm going to talk to you about who the course is aimed at and the business outcomes that the syllabus and the course are intended to achieve. I'll talk to you about the actual content of the course. I'll talk you through what we cover. I'll talk to you about the exam format. I'm going to do a little illustrative lesson. So I'm going to do a mini lesson, some of the content of what we cover in the course. Where I'm going to show you the application of a technique called boundary value analysis. And then there's time at the end for me to summarize up, and then I'll open up the session for questions. So if you have questions, if you don't mind leaving until the end of the session, then I'll deal with them at that point in the presentation. I'm sorry. Could I ask you, I'm going to ask you if you could mute your microphones until the end of the session, if that's okay.
So
if you'll just start, I'm just going to mute everyone's mics. So who is this? Let me start with who is this course aimed at? So this is a 3-day course, and it's aimed at everybody who wants to pick up some practical knowledge about the basic fundamental concepts of software testing. So I'm sorry, could you all please, there'll be time for questions at the end of the session. So I'm just going to mute everyone's microphones until then, if that's okay. So we're aiming this course at anybody who's interested in testing, basically. So in any kind of role, not just people directly in the testing role. So product owners, business analysts, testers, anybody in the testing, test engineering kind of skill streams, consultants, test managers, people who are getting involved in maybe discrete piece of testing like UAT testers, software developers, anybody who wants to pick up a basic understanding of testing. So obviously, the kind of core audience are going to be people who are directly involved with testing. But anybody who just wants to know more about testing, project managers, quality managers, IT directors, then this is a good course to give you an introduction to the concepts and the practices. And the syllabus itself has outlined the key business outcomes. So what we're covering in the course, and for people who successfully pass the exam, so if you achieve foundation certification, which is what this course is aimed at, then amongst other things, we're hoping to give you a common vocabulary about testing. Often the problem with IT is there's a lot of jargon. Testing's no different. So the whole idea of ISTQB is to get a common sense of good practices and terminology. Obviously, the aim of this course is to give people an understanding of the fundamental concepts. But also, it's not just theory. We're going to give you some practice and some practical. So you're going to get understanding of how development testing is different in different contexts. That will help you in understanding how we can optimize testing differently. You should be able to participate more effectively in product reviews. So any kind of documentation reviews, story reviews. And also you're going to get an introduction and practice into some of the most commonly used techniques in test design, and they can be applicable at any test level. And interpret test results, execute tests from given specifications, report on results. Also understanding some of the key test management principles. It'll help you with your resource strategies, your planning. And because we're talking about teaching you the concepts and the common language, hopefully defect reports are going to be clearer, more understandable. You'll understand the kind of project factors that influence our why test approaches have to be different in different contexts. You'll understand the value that software testing gives to, so that is really useful in talking to other stakeholders, and how we need to align testing with projects, their objectives, their targets. And you'll get an appreciation of how we select and implement test tools. So the syllabus was put together to give people a good grounding and to be able to contribute and add value to conversations around test application testing and test planning. So in order to do that, we are going to cover 6 sections on the course. There are 6 chapters. And we're going to start by explaining the fundamentals of testing. So I'm going to explain to people, or me and my colleagues on the course will explain and make you understand why testing is necessary. We'll explain exactly what we mean by testing, all the different testing activities. We'll summarize that up within a set of 7 testing principles, which are useful to keep in mind at all times when discussing testing with people and making planning decisions. We'll introduce you to both the factors that influence the way we put test processes together, but we'll introduce you to a core fundamental test process that's consistent for pretty all projects. To the basic steps in putting together the planning, the analysis, the design, the implementation, the execution of tests, the completion and wrapping up of a test engagement and test project. And we'll also talk and explain the psychology of testing. Why does that people who test look at the world differently? Testers have a very different mindset to developers and business people, and that it's helpful to understand that, and it's helpful to appreciate that in facilitating communication between all the different stakeholders. So once we've given you a grounding in the basics, we'll then going to explain to you how testing fits into the development life cycle. So we'll explain the 2 most commonly used development life cycles, the sequential approach and the iterative and incremental approach. We'll introduce the common characteristics of those approaches and then break them down into the different test levels, the test types that we use. So you'll have an understanding how the testing is organized around different types of different types of software projects. We'll talk to you about the different test types, the functional and non-functional types, and also the context of testing once a software product's gone live. So the importance and the activities around maintenance testing, the testing of updates and enhancements to products. We'll talk about testing in every possible context. So in section 3 of the syllabus and section 3 of the course, we'll talk to you about some of the early testing we can do, the static testing, introduce you to the basic review process, give you some practice in actually applying review techniques in examining documents. So there'll be a practical exercises in using checklists to find defects in documents. And we'll also explain and help you understand the benefits of static testing, why it's so important, why we can significantly reduce costs in projects. So it's the static testing application, and then dynamic testing, the actual running of tests to find out what software actually does in practice. So we're going to talk about test techniques. I'll explain the key categories, and then we'll go into those techniques in depth. So I'll introduce you to the 5 of the most commonly used black box techniques based on requirements. We'll also look at some of the basic ideas around white box or structural testing. And again, we'll work through some worked examples of the kind of testing you can do to cover code. But also we'll talk about the supplementary techniques, the experience-based techniques that can be used when no documentation is available or when you're pushed for time, and as a good supplement to these systematic black box and white box techniques to find broader defects or to gain greater confidence. Now, we'll also look at the core principles around test management. So we'll explain to you how testing and test teams are organized, the different key roles, and we'll then talk about, in terms of test management, what happens, what are the key considerations around planning a test engagement. So we'll look at the influencing factors in putting together test plans. We'll look at the high-level strategies we can adopt, how corporate policies and approaches may influence the test approach, how standards may influence. But we'll also look at the mechanics of producing a test estimate. And having formulated the plan, we'll then talk about how we need to monitor that plan, keep people appraised of progress, and control the plan. So what we need to do when the plan isn't going the way we expect. So there's the key control actions. We'll also introduce you to some of the core supplementary disciplines like configuration management. We'll look at risk management and how our knowledge of product risk can influence our test approaches and prioritize our work. And we'll introduce you to the key concepts around defect reporting, defect management, and why that's important, the key information we need to progress, and why defect reports are so valuable to both the developers and the testers and the process as a whole. And we'll introduce you to the concept of tool support for testing. So we'll give you an overall an overview of the main categories of tools that are available to support testing, and we'll look at some of the key considerations around test execution tools and test management tools. And we'll also discuss and talk about the effective use of tools. So how we can mitigate some of the key risks that make tools not return an investment for the organization. And we'll also look at the process by which we should select and pilot and implement test tools to support the test process. So you can see that it's a pretty comprehensive course. We're going through all the key disciplines and how testing fits into context. And interspersed in that course as we're going through is a mixture of lecture, discussion, practical exercises, a lot of practice on exam style questions, so that as well as appreciating how the theory is put into realistic use, we're also going to help you understand the format of the exam. Because again, a lot of people come to the course, they're not just interested in picking up the knowledge, getting the practical application and appreciation of testing. A lot of people are interested in career development and career progression. So the ISTQB exam is a multiple choice exam, 60 minutes duration, unless you qualify for extra time, in which case an extra 50 minutes is granted. There are 40 questions. Each question is worth 1 mark. To pass the exam, you need to get 65%, which is effectively 26 out of the 40 marks available. And to help people, we give plenty of practice in exam style questions as we go through the course, plus as exercise we do in the class, as homework, and as in-depth debriefing, so people understand how to address a question, tactics and strategies to address the exam. We also cover those. But we're getting people completely familiar with both the concepts and the certification process that takes place after the course. So that's again, I'm trying to stay within the 30-minute format and allow time for questions. So that's a kind of brief overview of the course. And to give you a taste of what goes on, I'm just going to run a little mini lesson here on one of the test design techniques. That's probably one of the most commonly used techniques in testing, which is a technique called boundary value analysis. And there are two approaches to boundary value analysis. So in this first approach, I'm going to show you what's called the two-value approach. And this is a black box technique, so it's based on a requirement. So I've got a very simplistic requirement here. An input field accepts a single integer value as an input, using a keypad to limit inputs that non-integer inputs are impossible. And the valid range is from 1 to 5 inclusive. So I'm going to transcribe this requirement into a number line, a model, a representation of the requirement. So if we've got single integer values and we can't do non-integer inputs, and also I would assume from that we can't do non-numerics. So I'm going to draw a number line to represent the input, which is an integer. And if I look at this, then the valid range is 1 to 5 inclusive. But if I'm looking at single digit integers, then that's the valid partition. And then any value less than 1, so 0 and below, that's invalid. And any value greater than 5, so 6 onwards. Now, if it takes single digit integers, I can't do more than 9 anyway, but that's another invalid partition. So the definition of a boundary is the maximum and minimum inclusive values in the partition. So that means in this respect, I'm just going to change my ink color. 1 is the lower boundary and 5 is the upper boundary. So if I'm using the two-value approach to boundary value analysis, then I need to test 0, 1, 5, and 6. Because 0 is the upper boundary in the valid partition, and 6 is the lower boundary in the invalid partition. So too big and too small. So if I'm testing the boundary of a specific partition with the nearest boundary value of the adjacent partition, I will test 0 with 1. And if I'm testing 1, I'll test 1 with 0. And if I'm testing 5, I'll test 5 with 6. And if I'm testing 6, I'll test 6 with 5. So I've got 6. I've got 8 possible tests, but you'll notice here we've got repetition. I've got duplication. So if I remove the duplicates, so I don't need to test 1 and 0 again because I've tested it with the first pair of tests. Likewise, I don't need to test 6 and 5 again. And what I'm testing here is, with these boundary tests, I'm testing that they haven't accidentally done something like greater than equal to 1 as a logical operator, because or they haven't accidentally done something like greater than 1 instead. So if the programmer puts the wrong logical operator in the code, then all of a sudden, if they do greater than 1, then 1 won't be valid. So what the boundary tests are doing, they're looking at those logical operators. Likewise, then if I code greater than 5, but if I code greater than or equal to 5, then we get 5 accepted in the invalid partition. So what the boundary tests are doing, they're making sure the developers don't implement the partitions incorrectly in the code. That's what this testing is doing. But if I remove the duplicates, my optimized test set, apologies, my terrible handwriting, will become 0, 1, 5, and 6. And those 4 tests will make sure all those 3 partitions have been implemented correctly. So the two-value approach is a general purpose approach, good enough for most situations. But sometimes you get situations where the software may be mission or safety critical. So if we get a situation where there's high risk, then we have a second approach called the three value approach. So my partitions and boundaries are identical to what we looked at before. So if the value range is 1 to 5 inclusive, then 0 and 6 become the boundaries of the invalid partitions. So there's my valid partitions, there's my invalid too big, invalid too small. And the definition of boundary hasn't changed. So my boundaries, if I write them down in a list, I've got 0, 1, 5, and 6. But if I'm taking the three value approach, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually test more thoroughly. So I test the boundary value of its specific partition, 0, with the value just below the boundary, so -1, and the value just above the boundary, +1. And if I'm testing the lower boundary of the valid partition, I test 0 and +2. And if I'm testing the upper boundary of the valid partition, I tested it with the value just below, so 5, and the value just below, which is 4, and the value which is just above, which is 6. And if I'm testing the lower boundary of the invalid partition, I test 6 with the value just below, which is 5, and the value which is just above, which is 7. So now I've got 3 tests per boundary. But again, if we look at this, we've got some duplication. So again, if I want to optimize this, then I'm not going to run the same test case twice. So if in my first 3 tests are -1, 0, and +1, then in my second test, I'm going to eliminate the 2 repeated tests. And now if we look at the upper boundary, then 4, 5, and 6, then I'm not going to test 5 and 6 again. So my optimized set is going to be -1, 0, +1, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, missed one off then. You may have noticed. I left the 2 off. +1, +2, then 4, 5, 6, 7. And what we're doing here is we are deliberately over testing, but this will also make sure, as well as those greater or equals, if anyone's got an equal operator, then a 3 value test will always flush out any defects. So the 3 value approach is used for high risk situations. It's a deliberate over test. Everybody okay? Sorry, you've all got muted. That was my classroom teaching. You've all got muted microphones, and I ask you, is everybody okay? Your microphones are all switched off. So that's just a quick explanation of one of the most commonly used techniques in testing, the boundary value analysis technique. But we've actually got 2 variations: 2 value, which is good enough for most situations. The 3 value approach, if you've got very high risk situations, will deliberately produce more tests. But by producing more tests, either find subtle defects or gain greater confidence. So if you're trying to show coverage to stakeholders who are nervous, the 3 value approach would give a lot of feedback on quality. So again, just keep an eye on time. Just a quick recap of what I've talked about. Then we talk about the foundation course being a 3-day course. It's a mixture of lecture and practical exercises. It's aligned to the key business outcomes which were specified in the by the ISTQB. And we cover the test process, we cover review techniques, we cover black box, white box, experience-based test techniques. We introduce you to test management principles. We give you an overview of the tool support available for testing. And the exam is multiple choice. It's 1 hour, 40 questions, 65%, so 26 out of 40 is needed to pass and get the qualification. Each question is of an equal value, each question being worth 1 mark. So quite difficult sometimes to compress a 3-day course into half an hour. So I've tried to give you an idea of what the course is all about. So I'd now like to open the field up. So if anybody's got any questions.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I would like to see the first slide where you explain what the course will look like in terms of the review and all the stuff. I just want to see it and just take note of that, please. Thank you.
Sure, just bear with me. I'll just wind it back to that. Is it this one?
No, the first one. Yes, this one. Perfect.
That one, the business outcomes. Sure. Let me know if you've got it.
Thank you. Got it. Thank you.
No problem. So that the slides going past so quickly. So anybody else got any questions? Then if there's no questions, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining me. Hope to see you on the course. Watch out for we'll record this webinar, so you'll get sent a copy of the webinar, but we're going to give you a nice surprise with that email as well. So if you want to know anything else about the course or other courses, if you go to our website, or you can always send us a query at enquiries@tsgtraining.co.uk. Well, thanks for spending time out of your busy lunch and your busy days. I hope this has been beneficial for you, and look forward to seeing you on one of the courses soon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.